Allow me to welcome you on behalf of the New Zealand Free Speech Union. My name is Roderick Mulgan. We claim to be New Zealand's largest civil liberties advocacy organisation. And you might wonder, why is a free speech union needed? Why are we here? Well, I'm sure that most of you are aware that this was not the first venue that we booked for this evening's event. We booked and paid the deposit on a venue that we've used in the past without any difficulty whatsoever. And somebody complained. And the owners of the venue said, too much trouble. Contracts don't matter. Good faith doesn't matter. Public dialogue doesn't matter. Go away. That is why we exist. We cannot take for granted the fundamental right to exchange opinions and information. We live in a world where that is under threat. Fortunately, we have a team. We can book something else. And the owners of that venue will be hearing from our lawyers in short order. That is why we exist. But the point, of course, is to bring you one more in our long series of interesting and stimulating speakers. This evening's speaker, Dr. James Lindsay, holds a PhD in mathematics, but is best known for his contribution to controversial public debate. He is the founder of the new Discourses website, which probes all sorts of interesting ideas. He is the author of How to Have Impossible Conversations, a book about the logical fallacies of debating and argument. That book was co-written with Peter Buttigieg. Peter Buttigieg was the last speaker we brought you in November last year. However, Dr. Lindsay is best known for his book, Cynical Theories. Now, if you want to read one thing about how we got as woke as we are, it's Cynical Theories. It traces the history of the thing from French postmodernism through academic activism to the point where we now deconstruct and decolonize and critically theorize everything. And what an awful idea that is. He's sold 500,000 copies. It's in 30 languages. There is clearly a real need for this sort of thinking. So, without any more from me, I turn you over to the man himself.
Thank you, all you fine Kiwis, for this wonderful introduction and this wonderful reception. I'm setting a timer for myself for your protection. And what you're going to find out is that I'm not actually controversial at all. So these venues that cancel me and the necessity of a free speech union is actually kind of a sad commentary. I'm not that controversial of a person, but I have a reputation that the internet has created for me that precedes me. And unfortunately, some of that reputation doesn't just come from the pitiful halls of Reddit and Twitter and that garbage. X, we're supposed to call it X now. It also comes from places like the Southern Poverty Law Center, which sounds like a very reputable, important place, but in fact is probably a front for intelligence operations and communists. And that's what I'm actually kind of here to talk to you about. I'm here to talk to you about the evolution of woke, which I've dedicated the last, it depends on how you count it, 5 or 7 or 10 years of my life to studying. Before anybody called it woke, and I mean literally before anybody called it woke, because the radical activists had not yet co-opted the word woke at the time. So I have all these writings calling it social justice activism or critical social justice, which is more accurate. I attempted in 2000, maybe 18 or 19, to float the concept of the term critical constructivist epistemology, but it seemed to have too many syllables for people to want to talk about, but that's the correct articulation of what woke is. In fact, I have a book that's titled Critical Constructivist Epistemology, written by Joe Kinchelow, who is a left-wing educator from Canada who died in 2008 or 9, so he's no longer with us, that I refer to as the Book of Woke. And you read it and they explain to you, well, what is woke? He doesn't call it woke. Nobody was calling it woke back then. Woke was African-American slang that said be hip to racism in the cities, be hip to racism in the police, be hip to racism in your life. Hip was the word they used for it in the 60s. Hip like awake. Now it's woke like awake. Means the same thing. Society doesn't quite work the way you think it does. Keep your eyes open. That was the original idea. And this idea got co-opted largely in 2014 and 15 to hear it from the people who were involved with Black Lives Matter originally, before it became a trained Marxist organizer front. The people who were involved with it originally after Trayvon Martin was shot in Sanford, Florida, did not believe necessarily these same things. They were just woke. And then these radical activists who claim, like Patrisse Cullors, who claim to be trained Marxist activists and radicals, co-opted the concept of woke, co-opted the concept of Black Lives Matter, and injected what's called critical race theory into the analysis. And so I want to talk to you about a little bit about this history, a little bit about what it is, a little bit about where it came from, a little bit how it's metastasized and transformed, and I think most importantly, a little bit about how it is now infecting the right wing in addition to the left wing. So it's really funny. I mean, I've heard some of the reasons that I've been canceled at some of these venues in New Zealand. It's like Canada beat you to this, like boo-hoo. Connecticut beat you to this. California beat you to this. I get canceled here and there. And it doesn't make any sense that I get canceled because I'm actually not that controversial. I'm very historical. I'm very philosophical. But the fact is that what woke means is that you've woken up to understanding how reality works in a fundamentally different way. And that fundamentally different way is outlined on the first page of the Communist Manifesto. But it is also something that can be applied to any line of stratification or marginalization or perceived marginalization in society. So you can have right-wingers who feel as though they've been marginalized as well, and that they can adopt this way of thinking, this Weltanschauung in German. That means worldview, way of viewing the entire world, a lens that you put on. Do you see the world more clear? I know some of you wear glasses, I also do. Do you see the world outside of needing glasses? Do you put on colored lenses? Do you see the world more clearly? No, you see the world tinted. And that's actually what woke is about. It's tinting your interpretation of how you see reality. So it's funny, I get canceled by these venues here in New Zealand on these accusations that I hold these far radical right ideologies. Thanks to the Southern Poverty Law Center and Wikipedia, you know, very important and deep sources like Wikipedia. So I get canceled for these because it's alleged that I'm far right, alt-right, maybe even a Nazi. And today, I released a podcast explaining, in fact, I read the second chapter of Mein Kampf explaining the errors that Hitler made in trying to respond to the Marxist takeover of Germany that led us to one of the worst tragedies in human history. And I have been canceled not just by the left for my fight against woke, but by the right for speaking up against neo-Nazi ideology, racism, and anti-Semitism arising from the radicals on our side. They're not on our side. They're the they're the right hand of the left. That's how it works. You have a left that is obsessed with authoritarian control and the transformation of society, and that they have woke up to a intrinsically unfair society that they have to resist. And it has two hands. The left hand does what Marxists do, the right hand does what fascists do. And they're not the same, and I'll outline that for you. But no more clearing my throat, let's just talk. Woke comes from African American slang, but what actually happened is in roughly 2014 and 15, it got co-opted by radical Marxists who wished to transform society, beginning in America primarily. Of course, everything filters out from American pop culture, so here it is in New Zealand, there it is in Australia. Canada's is, the kids call it cooked. Canada is cooked. The UK under Keir Starmer, who is a Fabian socialist, is cooked. It is a very bad situation for them. We look at Europe and we wonder what in the living hell Germany is doing. We wonder what the rest of Europe is doing because they are also, as the kids would say, cooked. And woke ideology is actually at the heart of this, especially in the English-speaking countries. So what happened? Where did it come from? And I have made the case. I stood before the European Parliament 2 years ago this month, and I gave a speech there that's probably the best thing I've ever said, so it's better than this. Go look it up. Go out in the hall, watch it instead. Save yourself some trouble. And what I said is that woke is the evolution of Marxism over the march of 150, 180 years of history in order to be able to infect Western civilization. Because Western civilization has had something that the Russians didn't have that left them susceptible to the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, and that the Chinese didn't have that left them to the Chinese Civil War of 1949 when Mao Zedong took power and established the People's Republic of China, that the Eastern Bloc didn't have when it got conquered state by the Soviets, that the Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam, North Korea didn't have when they were taken over by the Soviets and the Chinese respectively. And what the West had, for lack of a better term, let me be very me-centric here, was the American dream. It doesn't have to be the American dream. It is the possibility to apply your talents with freedom in order to take what you have, your capital, and build more capital with it. And a lot of people on the left don't like this dream, but Karl Marx really didn't like this dream. And this dream repels communism. If you believe that you, by your hard work, some good luck, and a lot of effort, can build your life and climb the economic ladder, the economic agitation of communism does not affect you. And so what you need, if you are a Marxist wishing to transform American society, British society, Kiwi society, Aussie society, any Western country, because none of them fell except East Germany, what you need is a way to get in that doesn't use economics. On the first page of the Communist Manifesto, as I said, Karl Marx wrote that the entire march of history can be characterized as the conflict between antagonistic classes. Oppressor versus oppressed, in a word. So it's intrinsically, the word for this in the academic literature is a conflict theory. The goal is to, again, academic term, to stratify society. So this is a very geological island, so I know you all understand stratification, right? There's different layers. So you stratify society, and there's a line of stratification, rich versus poor, or I guess the bourgeois versus proletariat, right? Black versus white, colonizer versus indigenous, straight versus gay, man versus woman. Cis heteronormative, which has a lot of syllables in it, versus queer, which does not. And you say across that line of stratification there is an intrinsic conflict, and we define the movement of history itself in terms of how that conflict transforms from one class conflict to another class conflict in different societies over time. And because the essence of what we call the American dream in America, that if you work hard and you're talented and you have a good idea, and most importantly, any socialists in the audience, you're willing to take the risk to implement your idea and maybe lose, and it works, you too can be a billionaire. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, because the reason you became a billionaire is because you provided enough value to enough people that enough people gave you some part of their wealth to give you $1 billion. Not just $1 billion, $1 billion of excess. And if you can't do that line of stratification in economics, you do that line of stratification somewhere else. Race, sex, sexuality, the whole intersectional, etc. And that is what woke is. It's the evolution of Marxism to the soft spots of the West, where we have a reservoir of guilt or shame that can be exploited in order to make us compassionate and empathetic, so that we will fall into not compassion or empathy, but the conflict theory of class versus class that Marx said fundamentally characterizes society. Woke is the evolution of Marxism like a virus to infect a society that cannot be infected by economic conflict theories. And this is the speech I gave in Brussels, standing at the European Parliament 2 years ago, and it's the quintessential explanation of what it is. But woke means woke up. Woke means awake. Like in Germany in 1935, 33, I guess, where the Nazis proclaimed Erwacht Deutschland, awake Germany. Now I'm not talking about communists. I'm talking about National Socialists. Awake Germany, Erwacht Deutschland, awake. It means you've woken up to a corruption of your society based in an intrinsic conflict between classes, where there is an upper class that's spoiling society for its own advantage, and there's a lower class that is exploited and oppressed by this dynamic. And like I said, it doesn't have to be economics, it could be race, it doesn't have to be sexuality, it could be sex, it could be anything. And it could also be the intrinsic view of what it means to be a German, to live in a nation, to be part of a nation. And you create an in-class and an out-class. Now, on the left and the right, these things don't work exactly the same way, but you have the same concept that you've awoken to what? To that there's a true consciousness of reality that understands in critical theory terms that this all has been rigged and arranged by the corrupt elite to suppress the broad masses. That's awake. And that everybody else labors under a false consciousness of reality. They don't know their own suffering. They don't know what the problem is. Let me give you an example of not knowing, of false consciousness. So there's a man in the United States. His name is Larry Elder. I know you guys, you Kiwis, tend to be sharp on American politics, but I'll give you a little bit of background. Larry Elder was raised in East LA. That's what we call the ghetto. Larry Elder is a black man from East LA, raised in the ghetto. Larry Elder is a conservative. The horror. And Larry Elder dared in the state of California to run for governor against Gavin Newsom, who still holds that seat, a couple of years ago. As a conservative. We're not supposed to say as a conservative, we're supposed to say as a black man or as a, wheelchair-bound lesbian, something, whatever, exasperated, etc. And what did the Los Angeles Times do when Larry Elder ran for governor as a conservative black man? Remember, we've had Black Lives Matter. Black voices matter. Black people matter. Black people have to be recentered. White people have to overcome white supremacy, have to be removed from the center. That's the narrative. And Larry Elder ran for governor as a conservative. How dare he? And the Los Angeles Times ran an article with the headline, "The Black Face of White Supremacy." They've expanded this since. Now we have I'm not joking, multiracial white supremacy, multiracial whiteness has come out of this. And so you stare at this and you ponder, what in the world does that mean? How in the world can a black man raised in the ghetto of East LA possibly qualify as the black face of white supremacy? And it's because what? Because he's white? No. Because he supports the Klan? No. Because he doesn't support the correct political ideology. So you're only black under this woke ideology of blackness if you say the things that black people are supposed to say according to the ideology of wokeness. Just like how in Mao's China, you were only people if you supported Mao Zedong's socialism. Mao gave a speech in 1957. It was called On the Correct Handling of the Contradictions Among the People. It's a very, very famous speech from February 1957. And what he said in 1957 in that speech was that it's very simple. There are kind of two categories. There are the people and there are the enemies of the people. And how do you know who are the people and who are the enemies of the people? He said, well, the people vary throughout time. It depends on what's going on. During the Sino-Japanese War, there were the people who supported the Chinese against the Japanese and the enemies of the people who supported the Japanese or didn't support the war. And then later, during the Chinese Civil War, which took place immediately after, the Second Sino-Japanese War took place during World War II. So while, the war in Europe was raging, and we know about that, Hitler and the Allied forces fighting the Axis, whereas also the Pacific Theater, you guys might know more about that here in New Zealand. And in the Pacific Theater, what we often don't end up talking about is the fact that the Japanese were utterly, and the word is, raping China. The rape of Nanking is what it's called. And it was the most unbelievably brutal act of war that I've ever read about. So much so that the Chinese communists at first loved the United States until the Korean War kicked off and Mao ran a propaganda campaign against it, because they dropped 2 bottles of sunshine on Japan and stopped the Sino-Japanese War. Because they were losing millions of their citizens in absolutely brutal conditions. So the people during the Sino-Japanese War supported China, and the enemies of the people supported Japan. Then it goes forward into the revolution. That was 1940 to 1945 or so. 1945 through 1949 was the Chinese Civil War. Mao decided, let's use the war-torn circumstances to run a civil war bid to destroy the Kuomintang National Party and take power, and he did. And so the people were the people who supported the CCP taking over from the Kuomintang, and the enemies of the people were the people who did not support that. And so here in 1958, or 7, I guess, 1957, the people were the people who supported the building of socialism, and the enemies of the people were the people who did not support the building of socialism, and he wrote that in black and white. You are the people if you support us, you are the enemies of the people if you don't support us. Now let's go back to Larry Elder. If you run for any public office as a black person on the left, you are a black voice. And if you do not, if you run as a Republican, you are the black face of white supremacy, the people and the enemies of the people. It's the exact same program. This is woke logic, and it has nothing to do with race. Nothing to do with race. Do you accept the ideology or do you not? That's all it comes down to. Larry Elder, as our Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley said, was a black face who didn't want to be a black voice. And they could have no more black faces who don't want to be a black voice and no more brown faces who don't want to be a brown voice. And what logic on earth explains that other than you agree with the ideology? Pete Buttigieg is homosexual. That's Mayor Pete Buttigieg, who was the Secretary of Transportation under Biden, formerly the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, controversially appointed as a secretary in the cabinet. And Mayor Pete, Secretary Pete, is gay. And yet the left, when he took during the Democratic primary in 2020, when he briefly ran for president before he got brought into the stable and given a cabinet option, the left said he wasn't a good option for president. He might be gay, they said, but because he doesn't speak with a gay voice, he's not really gay. And what do they mean by not speaking with a gay voice? They said in the article that he wore suits and ties to work instead of dressing the part, I guess. I mean, the Biden administration really put that to the test, I suppose. So you either toe the line of the ideology or you don't. That's woke. And it's not going to be any different under Deutschland Erwacht Deutschland, I'm sorry, I said it backwards. It's not going to be any different. If you towed the Nazi line, you were fine. You talked to a Jew. I'm reading this book right now about ordinary Nazis. It's not called Ordinary Men. It's a different book. It's called They Thought They Were Free. And this guy, he's Jewish, he's over there in the 50s interviewing normal guys who are Nazis. And he's talking to them and he's like, what was it like? What do you think? And then this German guy's telling him, well, I talked to my friend so-and-so, he's Jewish, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, well, don't you think that you could have gotten in trouble? And his answer was, no, nobody doubted my loyalties. So you couldn't talk to a Jew in Germany if your loyalties were in any doubt, the loyalties to the Nazi party. Same exact program. Yeah, sure, you're a German, but you're talking to a Jew. So you're not speaking with a German voice. You could say it in the kind of modern parlance. Same program. In other words, there's an us who's on the program, and there's a them that's not on the program, and all of the problems in society are caused by the them who are not going along with the program. That was Mao, that was woke, that was Nazi. It's the same exact program in all three cases. So we've implemented this program called DEI throughout our society. That's the epitome of woke. Where does DEI come from? Diversity, equity, and inclusion. It comes from the Soviet Union. A lot of people don't know this. I didn't know this. How embarrassing is this? I gave a lecture series in 2021 in October called The Marxist Roots of DEI. And I didn't even know it was a Soviet program called Korenizatsiya. It was literally a Soviet program outlined by Stalin called Korenizatsiya. And here's how Korenizatsiya worked. Korenizatsiya means, Koreni means roots. Zatsiya is like the process of, or ification in English, right? So rootsification, laying down roots, putting down roots. Here's how it worked. See if this sounds familiar to you. The Korenizatsiya program went around to the ethnic minority populations like Ukrainians, Latvians, Estonians, and so on, around the greater Soviet Federation, and said to them, the great Russian is imposing Russianness on you. And we, the Soviets, the socialists, believe that's wrong. We think your nation should be able to self-determine. We think your schools should be in your native languages. We think that you should be able to do business in your native language. There should be absolute protection for your national identity. But did you also know that your national identity was intrinsically more socialist than the Russian feudal system? They have all these feudal ideas. You guys already understand the idea of community. And so what happened was the people who bought the Soviet lies about what it meant to truly be Ukrainian or Estonian or Latvian in terms of being socialist. In other words, the socialists among them got elevated by the Soviets, given positions of power over their regions, which were run in their own language now, but as socialist satellites. And they were brought in some cases, to run a satellite congress in Moscow. And guess what? If you were Russian in Moscow, let's say that you're at the second party or fourth party, whatever, Congress, the Soviet Union, and you were one of these Ukrainian guys who got brought in as a commissar under the Korenizatsiya program, and you said, I think that we should do some really awful, hardcore communist thing, and one of the Russian members said, I think that goes too far, we shouldn't do that. Now Stalin had a tool to say, you bigot, that's a Ukrainian, how dare you criticize from your position of great Russian chauvinism? And the implementation would happen. You had an uncriticizable, bureaucratic, political officer class made out of all of the ethnic minorities around the Russian Federation, and there were about a dozen of them. You couldn't criticize them because it would be great Russian chauvinism to do it, and they always were handpicked by the Soviets as the socialists among those programs, and then they also ran their nations under those conditions. Does that sound familiar? Does that sound like inclusion? It's exactly what inclusion is. And if you were a Ukrainian and you didn't go along with the program, what were you? You were the blackface of white supremacy. You could not be included. You had internalized great Russian power, or whatever the heck the word was, that they didn't want you. You were a kulak. We know what happened to the kulaks. They were liquidated by the millions for not going along with the program. And so they created an entire political officer class, commissar class, who couldn't be criticized by anybody who was Russian, and handed an immense amount of power to the Soviet bureaucracy to punish anybody who dared to criticize their ideas. Of course, maybe the most radical ideas would be fed to those people so that they could put them forth, and it would be racist or bigoted or whatever. Great Russian chauvinism is the word. to criticize them. That's the inclusion program. So inside, how bad does this get? Inside the Korenizatsiya program was another program called Raznobratsiya. Do you know what the word Raznobratsiya means in Russian? Anybody speak Russian? My pronunciation's horrible, I'm sure. It means diversity. As Lenin put it, it means diversity in form and unity in content, or achieving unity in content through diversity in form. So it means you look different, but you think the same. In modern parlance, it means, yeah, maybe you're black, but you're a critical race theorist. Maybe you're gay, but you're a critical sexuality theorist. Maybe you're a woman, but you're a critical feminist. Critical theory every single time. Critical consciousness of your identity. You don't want to be a black face who doesn't speak with a critical black voice. That's what it means. Unity in content through diversity in form. And that was an essential part of this program. And what was the goal of the Korenizatsiya program? Was it just to build commissars and do this weird diversity thing that sounds exactly like what we've been doing? No, actual equality. I can't say that one in Russian. That one has lots more syllables. Actual equality, which means not just economic equality, but also social and cultural equality. We call it equity, DEI. The Korenizatsiya program was a Soviet project through the 1920s. Guess how it ended? Anybody have a guess as how it ended? It ended exactly like our societies are going right now. And then Stalin said, none of this is working, everybody's Russian now, and if you don't agree, we kill you. That's how it ended. The new economic policy demands it. That was the DEI program of the 1920s. It got imported as resist Han chauvinism into Mao's China, and Mao said explicitly word for word that he was importing the program that the Russians called Korenizatsiya in order to do the ethnic issues within the Chinese people. There were 56 races of China. Han is the largest by far, and there are 55 minority races, and they used the exact same program to undermine the Kuomintang, to say that the nationalist project was actually trying to force everybody to be Han Chinese instead of being Chinese in their own ways, and that they must resist the Han chauvinism. It was the exact same program. And Mao, even after he took power, every time he started to slip, he would reinvigorate, criticize Han chauvinism. This experiment has been run before. Herbert Marcuse, the leading neo-Marxist of the middle of the 20th century in the United States, obviously came from Germany first. Herbert Marcuse openly said in an interview in 1969, he said, certainly, and this is a direct quote, every Marxist today who is not a communist of strict obedience is a Maoist. So do you think he was unaware of the programs like Criticize Han Chauvinism that went on to become Criticize White Supremacy that we've just lived with for several years? Of course he wasn't. He was the architect that led to what we've been dealing with for these last many years. But like I said, this isn't just a problem with communism, whether it's the Soviet program of Korenizatsiya, whether it's the Marxist conflict theory at the heart of the entire operation, evolving to figure out how to attack Western societies to undermine our social and economic systems so that they can seize control of them, to seize the means of production. It's not just that. It can also infect right-wing spaces. But let me do a tangent real quick, because I said that seize the means of control of production. Everybody thinks that means economics. This is way wrong. The Marxists are not interested in seizing the means of economic production to seize the means of economic production. It is not about giving the workers control of the factories, or they would have just given the workers control of the factories. The goal of the Marxists was to seize the means of production of what? Economic conditions, which they believed create men at their essential level of who they are. They called that material determinism in Marxist theory. So the goal was to seize the means of production of man himself. Why? Because Marx defined true communism, not crude communism, as the positive transcendence of human self-estrangement by private property. So you have to transform who you are on a spiritual level to no longer desire to have private property and see yourself as an individual, and then communism can work. It's a religious program to transform who you are into something that you are not. So why is it always going to fail? Because we're not intrinsically social beings the way that Marx posited that we are. And we're not going to intrinsically be forced to transform ourselves. But the Nazis were no different. They were going to transform you into the Superman, the Ubermensch, the Aryan race. I'm looking at my clock and thinking I can't do this. I'm not going to get into the weird theosophical race ideology behind the Nazis, but I suffice it to say some people got blasted with it in the car with me earlier today. It's really creepy. But the fact of the matter is that you can conceive of the nation itself in the exact same terms. There's a nation, and it was great. And it can only be great again if we figure out who's ruining it. And you can create a scapegoat class, the enemies of the people, the scapegoat class, like the Jews or the white people or whoever else. You can make a scapegoat class and say that the nation itself would be more successful if we got rid of these interlopers who are watering down our ethnic heritage, who are poisoning our economic system, who are poisoning our cultural system with things like pornography, which they can then blame on the scapegoat class entirely, as though I just literally saw on my Instagram the other day. I've long thought this is the case, that as long as human beings had the ability to draw, they probably drew sex stuff. And I saw this cave drawing or carving into the stone of, we'll call it P in V for PG purposes. And I was like, 13,000 years ago, you have to really work with a chisel that you don't even have a real chisel to get this drawn, and that's what you draw. Or you can just blame the Jews, why not? And you get the exact same program. Here's the difference. This is the intrinsic difference. The communists have the decency to lie to you and pretend it's for good. Here's what they say. The communists say, we live in an oppressive hierarchy. That hierarchy is evil. Give us power and we will end the hierarchy and everybody will have actual equality, DEI, equity. The Marxists, the fascists, their reaction comes along and says, there's an intrinsic hierarchy in society. And the Marxists have come along and tried to screw it up. And look how bad everything is. We didn't have all this bad stuff a few years ago. If we lean into the hierarchy and do oppression on purpose, things will be good again. So rather than saying, as the Marxists do, that over the course of a socialist government, that the state will wither away of its own accord for lack of being needed, and you arrive at a utopia of a stateless, classless society, that's the false promise of the communists. The fascists say, no, the oppression is what made us great, and the oppression is what we've gone away from, and that was a mistake, so we're going to go back to the oppression, and we're going to establish a Reich that will last 1,000 years to keep the oppression so that society stays good. Hitler promised 1,000, delivered 12. Not really a good percentage, 1.2%. Good job, Adolf. But this is happening on left and on right. The reaction to the left is already coming. Our young people under 30, in particular in the United States, it's a little different here on your blissful island because you haven't been polluted with the next wave of American bullshit. But the next wave of American bullshit is happening where I live. And the next wave of American bullshit is the only way to fight communism is with fascism.